Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 232. And today it is Terri's turn to share something. Terri, what do you have?
Well, Daisy, I have gone back to another of my newer favorite podcasts. It's not new. It's newly favorite to me. And as I mentioned before, partly because I accidentally paid for a subscription to it. So I'm going to get as much value
You're good at doing that.
I am. I'm going to try and get as much value out of this one as I can this year. And so it is Hidden Brain. And the title is How to Win People Over.
Mm-hmm. Handy thing to be able to do.
Yes. So on this episode, he had a guest named Allison, I think it's Fregal, but I could be wrong. And she is an organizational psychologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill here in the US. And she is the author of a book called Likeable Badass: How Women Get the Success They Deserve. And one of the things I found really cool about her job and this episode is it really talks about that they're doing research on understanding how we influence people, and definitely not how to influence people to manipulate, or this wasn't a sales kind of thing of, how do we get people to switch their political party or, buy your yacht or anything like that. But what they talk about really in this episode is, we are often told by people who care about us that we just shouldn't care what people think about us. But the reality is that's not very likely that we just wouldn't care. And there are reasons why caring what other people think about us can be useful. And, obviously her book is about being perceived in certain ways. And that doesn't mean being perceived in a way that you're not. Doesn't mean, again, manipulating people, but helping people to know you. And I think, I have not looked at the book yet, but I think obviously, especially in the world of work, having people's respect and having people want to trust you, do work for you, follow your instruction or anything like that is really important. So she goes back through some examples in her life where, for example, in high school, she ran for office in her class and didn't win. And so the next year knew that maybe she wasn't humorous enough in her speech, and maybe she didn't promise enough cool things, and she was running for vice president. And so her mom helped her write her speech, and she thought for sure she was going to win this time, and she did not. And so again, just really made her kind of curious. How do we influence people? How do we help people want to have contact with us or whatever? And obviously, at the beginning of the episode, he was talking about, when you're going to date someone, you might not do certain behaviors on the first date or two because you want them to be interested in you. You want them to want to go out with you again. She then talked about another example that I thought was really interesting. She did her undergraduate at Dartmouth, very prestigious school in the US, and then she did her PhD program at Stanford, another very prestigious school. And what she talked about in this episode is that when asked, where did you go to school? She plays what she calls introduction dodgeball. She was dodging answering that question. And she sometimes would give really vague answers like, the Northeast. So people would follow up. Which state and which school, And she realized that she was trying to downplay it because she didn't want people to think that she thought she was better than them. And then the two in this episode talk about how it could have really backfired. People may have thought, you're purposely not telling me because you think you're better than me and you don't want me to know that. So almost regardless of how she did that, she risked making it more awkward and placing emphasis on something that wasn't really there. And then she described, for example, it was always easier for her to answer the question when she knew that the other person also went to a prestigious school, because she knew that factor was kind of taken out or at least she wasn't perceiving that it might be a barrier. So again, just kind of thinking about, how do you present yourself? How do you show who you are to influence people? She mentioned a famous poet, Christopher Marlowe, and that he had a saying, and she said, it's really bad when you quote people who've died a very long time ago because we don't really have much documentation of what they actually said. But basically, he said that we control 50% of a relationship, which I think is true. We only control our part. So I only control 50% of our relationship, Daisy, but we influence 100% of it. So it's about kind of, we can influence our level of respect, our level of people wanting to connect with us. We can influence that. We can't control it.
Oh, that makes sense, yeah.
And we can't control the other people. So she breaks it down. Again, I think a lot of this, when you hear it, you'll think more related to work, but I think this holds true in other areas of our lives as well. But she talks about that there are two primary things in her research that they have kind of boiled it down to. And that is assertiveness and warmth. And how funny that these seem to be opposites. But people will be more influenced, will be more likely to respect you if you are assertive about things, because it conveys competence, confidence. So people tend to, again, this is in research, but they tend to trust people who are assertive and follow them and believe them, cooperate with them. And then she talked about warmth and, this idea that if you express that you care about me, I'm more likely to respect you and follow you and do all of these things. And then she talked about how if you put this on a grid with an x-axis and a y-axis, whereas you score higher on assertiveness, and if you score higher on warmth, that quadrant there in the upper right-hand corner is going to be the people who are most influential and have the most kind of status and success. And then the other ones, you might be seen as more assertive, but not as warm, or you might be seen as more warm, but not as assertive, or you might not be seen as either. And so these are kind of what they're figuring out about what people are really influenced by. One of the things that I thought was interesting about the way she talked about this is that rather than looking at a deficit, we should be looking at what can we add to where we already are. So if I'm not really known as being warm, I don't have to become someone different, but I can do some things to help convey more warmth. I can smile more when I talk. I can ask someone about their family. That we can add to what we already do to increase kind of our rating on one of those two axes. She shared an example. She's a professor, and she shared an example from teacher reviews that I thought was really interesting. What they found is that beginning teachers are ranked pretty highly, and probably because they seem knowledgeable and they're warm, they're friendly. And then you might make some predictions about what happens over a professor's career. Will they be seen differently? Will they be ranked differently? And they found that for male professors, it didn't change over the career, whether they were beginning career, mid-career, or end of career. But for women in academia, they are seen as assertive and warm in the beginning, and assertive and warm at the end of their career. You can almost imagine in the middle of the career, where you're most getting accolades for success and you're leading the department and you're getting all of these things, you're seen as more assertive and less warm.
Interesting, yeah.
She was very struck by the gender difference in that doesn't change for the male professors.
Well, and also the adjectives used don't tend to be things like assertive, do they? Tend to be pushy and
that's right.
And other things to describe.
Absolutely. So I thought that was a fascinating piece of the research that she shared.
Mm.
So she did talk about one thing that can help with connecting with people to influence positively is humor. And what it does is it creates social cohesion. And it's also, humor is an intelligent act. If it lands well, it's considered smart.
I was going to say it could go could go wrong as well, couldn't it?
Yeah. And so then she started talking about, for example, comedians. And she said, if you've ever watched a comedian who their whole kind of shtick is about poking fun at themselves, self-deprecation can be humorous, but depending on how you want to influence people, it may really fail because it tends to entertain, but it does tend to interfere with respect. And as I was listening to this part, Daisy, I just, it's one of those a little bit heartbreaking things I was thinking about. But I used to be a middle school teacher, and I thought I was doing well to do this. And I, of course, do use humor at times and sometimes not appropriately. And I always figured as an 8th grade teacher that kids can be kind of cruel and kind of rough on each other. So if I can get them to kind of put that toward me and kind of laugh at me, then they might not be doing it so much to each other. So I was self-deprecating a lot. And at the end of the school year, an 8th grader, he was so smart, but this 8th grader wrote in my end of the year evaluation, your self-deprecating talk doesn't help build your reputation or your credibility or something like that. And I was kind of crushed when he said it, but of course he's right. I thought I was doing it for good reason, but I was chipping away at my influence. I was talking down about myself while wanting them to do what I was encouraging them to do, learn from me, respect me, and feel warmth from me. So it's a great example of a tool that might be useful in certain ways can actually be problematic in another way. One of the challenges that she talked about that you and I have kind of highlighted here is that these two main categories that influence and perception, they're called person perceptions, really fall in is assertiveness and warmth. And they seem diametrically opposed. Like I'm either this or I'm this. And she really tries to help people see that they can be happening at the same time. We can be perceived both ways and positively in both of those. So she went through some examples of people and who've been very successful and connected very well with people and were able to influence people. And she went through an example about a former colleague, and he was very into golf. He was a very avid golfer. And he would go into situations trying to assess if the person liked golf, if they were a golfer, or if they hated golf, because he could connect with them. And so one of the factors she talks about that helps us influence and helps us connect is similarity. So she gives this example of a time where he was going into someone else's office and they were talking about something that was really difficult. It was not a positive meeting, but he noticed the guy had a hole-in-one trophy behind him on his bookcase. And so this colleague said to this other person, "Oh my gosh, is that a hole-in-one trophy? Did you win that?" And they launched into like a 55-minute discussion, each of them sharing their stories of their one hole-in-one experience. And it greatly affected how they were able to connect then. The host, Shankar, said to her, "But isn't this kind of unfair that it puts people who are already perceived as different at a disadvantage?" And she's been researching that and really trying to help people navigate that. So if I'm a person of color or being a woman or whatever it is, and she uses a great example from a recent political thing in the US that Stacey Abrams had recently lost the race for governorship in in Georgia, and African-American woman. So 2 at least statuses in her life that are in the kind of oppressed category, not the privileged category. And she was asked a direct question in an interview, do you have sights on becoming president? Are you going to run for president? And most people would try and downplay that. Well, if it happens, but she answered it very directly. And she said, of course I do. Absolutely. And then she added something to bring in a warmth kind of response. And she said, as a person of color, as a woman of color, I have responsibility to set an example for the young women, the young people of color in this country. And so it was a really great way of seeing she didn't have to ignore her difference and just highlight her similarities, but she could bring in that warmth and connect with people on that level to show not only do I have absolute aspirations to become the president, I care about people and I care about how that affects people. So again, lots of ways that assertiveness and warmth can be both present and that they don't have to cancel each other.
Yeah, because if you think about what comes to mind with assertiveness without the warmth, we were talking earlier about how women can be perceived, but it's often, I would think of words like arrogance would come to mind quite often with assertiveness, which doesn't have the warmth.
I think that's a great example, Daisy. And actually, she talked a little bit about that. She talked about how we respond to praise and how we engage in self-promotion gives us opportunity to demonstrate assertiveness and warmth. And oftentimes, if you're being praised, people think, no, that's going to sound arrogant or whatnot. Or if we promote ourselves at all, that's going to sound assertive, but definitely not warm. She referred to this response that actually helps in these situations is a brag and thank. So some might refer to this as dual promotion, where you're promoting yourself and other people at the same time. So when we promote ourselves, we say something good about ourselves, that could help our assertiveness, but it might not make us sound very warm. And so by bringing in something positive about others, that's showing our human nature, our warmth. So for example, if you win this huge award and you say, thank you, I worked so hard and I'm so proud of what I've achieved. Yes, that's assertive and it's appropriate. But you're right, that can turn some people off. But if you then say, and I would not have been able to do that without the support and all of the hard work from blah, 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 that really helps to balance out that. So now you're not only seen as assertive, but you're also seen as warm. You care about the people that work with you. So I think it's important for people to, just be looking at these ways that they can be seen as both. That we don't have to feel like, well, I'm either assertive and a jerk, or I'm warm and people kind of see me as a doormat, that I can be both. She talked about another version that she called humor bragging statements. So she gave an example of if someone is interviewing at a company and the company says, well, we'd like to know, what you're going to bring to us. And, you want to brag a little bit. You've got to tell them that you're pretty darn good, or why would they hire you, right? But you can do this with some humor. And so she gave an example of this person. And the first one, she basically said, I'm really great. I can do great things for your company. And that was it. And it just sounded uncomfortable bragging. In the next version, using humor bragging, she said, I'm a driven sales representative who's detail-oriented and passionate about serving your company's goals. That sounds great. I have a proven track record of turning caffeine input into productivity output. The more coffee you can provide, the more output I will produce. And again, they found a positive brag combined with humor shows warmth and connection. And so this is automatically a little more interest in this candidate. She's not just bragging,
Yeah.
but she's not talking herself down either to just be nice. So I think in general, you'll notice none of the talk here was about if you're wearing the right clothes or if you're driving the right car or, if you belong to the right clubs. It's not influence in those ways and being seen positively. It's how to influence people, friends, family, colleagues, if you're in an election, any way of wanting to be perceived positively by people to show your assertiveness and your warmth. And again, picturing that quadrant, the more you can kind of demonstrate how you fit in that upper right quadrant. I have competence, I have confidence, I'm assertive, and I have warmth. You are going to have more influential power with people. And again, not manipulation, not ways you can control people or, dominate people, but really have positive interpersonal dynamics with people.
Did they talk about whether this is a general thing from what appeals to people? I was just thinking, as you were talking about that, I was sort of thinking about different people, that you might watch on YouTube or social media or TV or whatever it was. And I was just sort of picturing different people who were in that quadrant and also picturing people that I didn't feel were in that quadrant. But there are people that aren't in that quadrant that are hugely successful. So does it depend a bit, are there people who are not interested in having that overlap? All they want is the assertiveness. They don't care whether you're warm or not. Does it matter about who you're trying to appeal to or influence?
Absolutely. That's a great point too. And even being on the other side of it, who do I give my respect to? Do I only give respect to people who are in that upper right quadrant? No. So for example, when I broke my clavicle and ribs, I went to an orthopedic surgeon. I liked that he was friendly, but that wasn't the most important criteria. His warmth would not have played as big of a role. If he had said, look, we need to do surgery and this is how we're going to do it and this is what I do and this is how it happens, everything, his assertiveness in this example would have been the bigger respect thing for me because I'm not going to have a lot of interaction with him. I don't need him to be a warm, fuzzy guy. I need him to be a very competent orthopedic surgeon. So I think you're right. There are examples where competence or the assertiveness isn't as valued and the warmth is even more important, and times the opposite. And if you kind of think about maybe even throughout your life, whether it's people in your life or people you watch on things, you might rate them differently. I sometimes still really hold these two things up and try and sort it out. Like, you and I listen to a lot of podcasts. I sometimes might listen to an expert who is a guest on a podcast that I think is just brilliant, very assertive. But I think they kind of treat the host like, they're being a jerk. I don't hold as much respect. I don't feel as influenced by them. I don't listen again. Whereas if I get the expert and warmth, like, why do you and I love Jim Quick? Besides the fact that his podcast episodes are quick. I think you and I both have talked about this. We really like him because he's very assertive and competent and very warm.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I was just picturing some of these, and it does tend to be men, but they have the assertiveness in spades, but not the warmth. And, you worry a bit about the influence that they do have that is lacking that warmth.
You know what she didn't talk about, which I think would be really interesting on this point, Daisy, is how does which quadrant you're in work differently for men and women? Your example is that, and maybe, I don't know if this is me saying a stereotype or if this is what research would show, that I think in certain settings, men with more assertiveness and less warmth are respected and seen as more worthy of following or being influenced by, or more influential. And then if we take the same type of category of whether it's a political environment or an academic environment or what, that if the women are seen too assertive and not warm enough, it's a negative.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it?
Whereas for the men being in that same quadrant, it was seen positively.
Well, I think that's probably a sort of general thing to be true, especially in business. Like I said earlier, the kind of adjectives that would be used would be very different for men and women. But yes, I was just thinking about, the kind of people you see on social media and the kind of influence they have. It's just really interesting, different people popping up in my mind, and I'm sort of trying to place them in that quadrant and which appealed more to me. I think, especially probably as I've got older, I probably want more warmth in there. There must be quite an individual thing to how you're receiving that, or how much you're influenced by somebody.
Yeah.
Very much depends on what appeals to you.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to kind of go through some examples, but I think I am often more influenced when there is more warmth. And I struggle to be as influenced when there's not warmth, even though the assertiveness is high. Except in certain examples, like I said, I'm pretty sure even if that surgeon had been kind of a jerk and cold, I still would have felt pretty influenced by his information.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, because I remember dealing with people like that when I've had surgeries, and I have noticed the lack of warmth. And yes, I know what you mean in that what you want is that assertiveness. But there is a big difference, I found, with how it's received and how I've walked away. Yes, I feel that they're competent and I feel like they're going to do a good job. But without that warmth, it doesn't leave you with a very good feeling. It's not that you don't have confidence that they're going to do a good job, but you feel a bit like whatever, piece of meat on the slab or whatever it is. You don't, without that warmth, it's not received in the same way.
Yeah, another level of that it makes me curious about is at least part of the research and findings, I would imagine, also depend on us as individuals. As we're talking about the gender piece of this, what do I expect? Do I expect more assertiveness from men? And do I give them more credit for being assertive? Do I expect more warmth from women? So it's really fascinating when you start breaking it down along our own identities and, how we kind of fit in different categories, and then the person who is maybe has the potential to influence us. What categories, demographics do they fall into?
Yeah, and your own stereotypes and your own biases, how it factors in. And, if a man is being too assertive and you feel like they're being arrogant, maybe you might think a woman being assertive like that is just being, a strong, go get him, kick ass.
Or vice versa, depending on what you are interpreting. That woman might just seem cold and heartless and rude. Whereas I might interpret those same responses in a man in that same thing, depending on my biases, as being very determined, being very clear, very boundaried, even though the behaviors might be the same. I think it's a fascinating field.
Yeah, and context is key, isn't it? I was just thinking about in our spheres that we work in, I'm just thinking about if a man was trying to tell me what to do with my diet and lifestyle choices versus a woman telling me that. A woman could probably get away with being a lot more assertive and less warm, although I would expect her probably to be warm. But a man would have to bring the warmth in, because if they were just assertive, I'd be like, well, you're a man, what do you know? So they would have to find a way through, and it would have to be with that warmth to deliver the same message that a woman could probably get away with delivering to me without as much warmth, because I would automatically listen to her because I would have that relatability straight away that she has that knowledge.
Yeah, I think that touches back into that part about the power of similarity. That it's almost like you give some status to her because she gets life as a woman.
Yeah.
Now, she might not understand anything about your life. You might not understand anything about, but you might be giving some automatic credibility to her. Whereas he might have to show more warmth or more similarity. Like he might, in this example, have to share with you, when I struggled with my own health and weight, and everyone told me there was nothing I could do to change it, that might be his way of gaining that credibility with you, that ability to influence that she maybe didn't need to earn.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So it's pretty individual.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep working on not using the self-deprecating approach. I definitely have found that one is not my best strategy, but I do want to keep working on that balancing act of assertive and warm, and not seeing that I have to be one or the other.
Yeah, finding ways of combining them. Very interesting.
I'm sure I'll be back to this podcast again because, I've paid for the whole year.
Well, it seems like quite a good one. So yeah, might as well get your money's worth.
It is good. And honestly, I feel like Shankar Vedantam, the interviewer, the podcast host, he is really good on these topics, like really knowledgeable. And, sometimes it's almost like you wouldn't know who was saying what. He's so skilled, even though he's not the topic expert.
Sounds good. Okay, well, until I see you next time, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.